The Jews had been in France and the adjacent areas of the Rhine Valley ever since their disastrous revolutionary insurrection against Rome had been crushed and the temple in Jerusalem destroyed. The Jews had come to the Rhine Valley in the time of the Romans because they were merchants. The Rhine and the Danube rivers comprised the major commercial corridor for Central Europe. In Ashkenaz, the Hebrew word for Germany, the Ashkenazim learned their new language, Jüdische Deutsch, Jewish German, or Yiddish. The Jews brought their messianic politics to the Rhine Valley. Being a revolutionary was, for many, part of what it meant to be a Jew, even if no one had acted militarily for almost a millennium. The Jews, according to Norman Kahn, refused to be absorbed into the populations among which they lived, even though their lot in the Middle Ages was by no means a hard one. The diaspora meant the dispersion of revolutionary politics. In the millennium following the defeat of Simon Bar Kokhba, the Jews interpreted the destruction of the temple and subsequent diaspora as God's plan for spreading revolution. Quote, "What made the Jews remain Jews, according to Kahn, was their absolute conviction that the diaspora was a preparation for the coming of the Messiah and the return to a transfigured Holy Land." Throughout the diaspora, the fantasy of a temporal heaven on earth coming about in and through history, as opposed to in eternity, captured the minds of the Jews and anyone in contact with the Jews who also considered themselves oppressed. The diaspora created exaggeration. Quote, "For the first time, the glorious future kingdom is imagined as embracing not simply Palestine, but the whole world. Through their suffering, the Jewish people would liberate all mankind." The Christian undertone is unmistakable. Moses Hess would take this reasoning to its logical conclusion in the 19th century, claiming the Jewish people had become its own Messiah. In the meantime, block quote, "the tyranny of that power will become more and more outrageous, the sufferings of its victims more and more intolerable, until suddenly the hour will strike when the saints of God are able to rise up and overthrow it. Then the saints themselves, the chosen, holy people who have hitherto groaned under the oppressor's heel, shall in turn inherit dominion over the whole earth. This will be the culmination of history." It's Moses Hess. The millennialist kingdom that will be the culmination of history, and that will have no successors, found numerous adherents, from Karl Marx to the neoconservative Francis Fukuyama, whose The End of History announced the neoconservative millennium when Marx's millennium failed. Jewish historiography, beginning with Heinrich Gretz, is a fertile source on the behavior of the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages. But it has distorting premises, some articulated, some not. The articulated premise of Jewish historiography is, in Norman Catter's formulation, that, quote, "the Catholic Church was the most persistent fount of anti-Semitism in the world," otherwise expressed as the claim that the core of Catholicism is anti-Semitism. The second and unarticulated premise of Jewish historiography, that anti-Semitism has nothing to do with Jewish behavior, plays an even greater role in shaping perceptions. The rise of the cities meant more commerce. More commerce meant more contact with Jews. More contact with Jews meant more conflict. Usury was the main point of contention. By mid-12th century, the time of the Second Crusade, usury was a serious social problem. Quote, "Extremely high interest rates and annual compounding," says Glick, "had led to crushing debt accumulations." Glick cites a letter from Pope Innocent III complaining, quote, "bitterly that the Jews extort not only usury, but usury upon usury," his term for compound interest. Innocent complained about the clergy of France, quote, "who were pawning everything from cathedral chalices to church-owned real estate." Innocent could not look with indifference upon the prospect of church possessions falling into Jewish hands. The problem was systemic, not easily solved by conciliar pronouncements. High interest rates and compounding are by their nature morally problematic. The Church, following prohibitions in the Hebrew Scriptures, tried to deal with it by moral condemnation. Christians were prohibited from exacting usury, so Jews had the field to themselves, with all of the social odium that went with it. The Jews, Glick notes, were often guilty of, quote, "leading the least productive members of society into ruin by encouraging them to consume beyond their means." The Jew could charge 40% interest compounded annually, ensuring that his debtor would never get out of debt. In a situation like that, the Crusades, which promised suspension of payment on debt as a recruitment incentive, seemed like a godsend. But the Crusaders would also remember the usury that compelled them to leave home when they arrived in Speyer and Mainz and saw the number of Jews living there. The Jews were often constrained to maintain high interest rates because the conditions of their survival were more political than economic. The Jews charged 40% interest to the average person for small sums, so they could provide large sums to the lord of the land at lower interest rates. Usury of such dimensions, Glick says, was inescapable if Jews were to meet the lord's incessant demands for tax payments and low-interest loans, but of course it meant that they soon had a reputation of greed and rapacity that confirmed everything said about them in the Gospels. Thus they were caught in a nasty trap. Disliked and resented by the general populace because they did no visible work and seemed to flourish on the misfortunes of others, too weak to defend themselves, hence dependent on rapacious lords. Jewish historiography breaks down into two schools, both of which view the church adversely. Norman Cantor maintains that nothing changed from the time of Bernard to the Second Vatican Council. The one constant of European history was the Catholic Church's anti-Semitism. The other school of Jewish historiography isn't much better. According to Jeremy Cohen, something changed in Christian-Jewish relations during the 13th century. Things went from bad to worse. The evidence supports Cohen more than it supports Cantor. Something did change then, but it was not the Church's teaching, rather the Church's image of the Jew changed. The traditional view, the Jew as a blind, carnal Israelite, as at the time of Christ, was replaced by a new understanding which saw him as a social revolutionary and outlaw. This change in perception occurred for two reasons. One, because of the conflict with the Albigensians in southern France, and two, because of the discovery of the Talmud. When Innocent III became Pope, quote, the status of European Jews was radically altered, and the policy of the Church became imbued with an increasingly aggressive and polemical spirit. It was not long before the crusade against the Albigensians led to the crusade against the Jews. In 1184, Pope Lucius III told each diocese to campaign against heresy in his decretal Ad Abolendum. 15 years later, Innocent III labeled heresy the worst sin possible because it was, quote, far more serious to attack the eternal majesty than the temporal. Concerned about Albigensianism in southern France, Innocent sent special legates there to prosecute heresy. The mendicants quickly engaged European Jewry because Jews were consistently supporting heresy to subvert the social order in Christian Europe. When St. Dominic arrived in Languedoc, he found, quote, widespread contempt for the clergy, due, Walsh notes, to the incessant propaganda of Jews, Saracens, and heretics. The Waldensians and Albigensians were, quote, communists of a sort who held, quote, unconventional views of sexual morality. Walsh insists the Inquisition never proceeded against the Jews, quote, either on racial grounds as Jews or on religious grounds as members of the synagogue. In a letter written on June 6, 1299, Philip the Fair complained that Jews, quote, receive fugitive heretics and conceal them. The Jews, quote, carried on a continuous and effective propaganda, unquote, throughout Christendom, which, while it persisted, was bound to make impossible the complete Christianizing of society. Louis Israel Newman claimed Jews were active in, quote, Christian reform movements, i.e. heresies, throughout European history, beginning with the Albigensians and Waldensians. The Waldensians were, according to Newman, Judaizers, individuals or groups who, as in Lombardy, adopted a Jewish outlook on life and Jewish forms of ceremony and conduct. Innocent III soon was upset about Jewish insolence as much as about Jewish usury. The Jews, he wrote to the Bishop of Paris in 1205, were so insolent that they hurl unbridled insults at the Christian faith, insults which it is an abomination not only to utter, but even to keep in mind. Thus, whenever it happens that on the day of the Lord's resurrection, the Christian women who are nurses for the children of the Jews take in the body and blood of Jesus Christ, the Jews make these women pour their milk into the latrine for 3 days before they again give suck to the children. On Good Friday, contrary to ancient law and custom, the Jews had taken to rioting through the streets and squares, ridiculing the Christians for adoring one nailed to a cross, and this in hope of diverting Christians from their religious obligations. The Jews were accused of leaving their gates unlocked until midnight for the convenience of thieves. No one, Innocent concluded, ever succeeded in recovering stolen property from Jews. The issue, as Innocent frames it, is behavior, not race. Innocent, quote, never forgot that Jesus was a Jew, unquote, which meant everything bad about the Jews could be changed by conversion, which he saw as a labor of love, bringing those with darkened minds to the truth. Innocent's animus toward the Jews was, as we have seen, not motivated by anti-Semitism, but instead by Jewish behavior, specifically usury, insolence, blasphemy, and support for heretical sects subverting the social, moral, and political order. The simplest way to prevent this enemy from destroying the social order while also protecting him from the unruly mob was to work for the Jews' conversion. And this is precisely what the church did. The mendicant order studied Hebrew and Arabic and read the sacred writings of the Jews to understand them better. This approach bore fruit. Jews converted in significant numbers toward the end of the 13th century, and when they did, they brought insiders' information with them and shared it with those in authority with the church. Unable to resolve their internal disputes, the Jews turned to the church, in particular the Dominicans, to use the Inquisition to resolve the issue of Maimonides' orthodoxy. The mendicants burned Maimonides' writings at their request. Jewish historians say this shows the Inquisition was, quote, perhaps actively looking for an excuse to strike out at the Jews. But the Dominicans were caught between two groups of Jews who could not resolve their own dispute, but who thought the church could. Hence both sides appealed to the Inquisition for a judgment. The incident was the opening act in the great drama of the church's discovery of and crusade against the Talmud. That crusade began in 1236, when Nicholas Donin, an apostate Jew who had become a Christian and a Dominican, was granted an audience with Pope Gregory IX. Donin called the Pope's attention to the blasphemies in the collection of Hebrew writings known as the Talmud. Donin's outspoken opinions had caused his expulsion from the synagogue 11 years earlier, so revenge may have been a motive, but Donin took with him an acute understanding of the role the Talmud played in Jewish life. It was, as Gretz claimed, the mainstay of Jewish civilization. Before Donin, the Talmud was virtually unknown among Christians, who, like Pope Gregory IX, labored under the illusion that the Jews merely followed the Torah, the Old Testament, books which Catholics also considered canonical. As a result of these discoveries, the Talmud suddenly became a prime target of Christian anti-Judaism. The campaign against the Talmud is the beginning of the change in the Church's attitude toward the Jews. On June 9, 1239, Pope Gregory responded to Donin's 35 petitions by dispatching him with a letter to William of Auvergne, Bishop of Paris. His letter substantiates the changed perception of Jews after the discovery of the Talmud. The Jews, Gregory wrote, quote, so we have heard, are not content with the old law which God gave to Moses in writing. They even ignore it completely and affirm that God gave another law which is called the Talmud, that is, teaching, handed down to Moses orally. The Talmud asserts rabbis are superior to the biblical prophets and that Jews must obey them even to the absurd point of abrogating Mosaic law. In a letter to St. Louis IX, King of France, in May 1244, Innocent IV, Gregory's successor, drew certain conclusions. The wicked perfidy of the Jews, he said, does not properly heed the fact that Christian piety received them and patiently allows them to live in Christendom through pity only. Instead, it commits such grave sins that are stupefying to those who hear of them and horrible to those who tell of them. The Talmud's blasphemies and its injunctions about defrauding the unsuspecting Goyim threatened the conditions under which Jews were tolerated. They called for rethinking the whole social compact. Upset by the harm that it was doing, St. Louis called a conference on the Talmud. In June 1240, Nicholas Donin had an extended debate with Rabbi Yehiel ben Joseph of Paris under royal auspices and presided over by the Queen Mother, Blanche of Castile. The rabbi was dumbfounded that he had to defend Jewish esoteric writing in a hostile environment. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Rabbi Yehiel, lacking any precedent for conducting a disputation of this sort, didn't know how to respond. When asked whether it were true that the Talmud claimed Jesus was condemned to an eternity in hell, immersed in boiling excrement, and Mary, his mother, was a whore, the rabbi could only respond, yes, those passages were in the Talmud. But they did not refer to that Jesus or that Mary. Not every Louis born in France is the king of France, Yehiel maintained, giving new meaning to the term chutzpah. Has it not happened, he continued, that two men were born in the same city, had the same name, and died in the same manner? There are many such cases. One Jewish historian referred to Rabbi Yehiel's denial as the birth of Jewish humor. Having exploded his own credibility, Yehiel could do little to refute Donin's claim that the Talmud sanctioned criminal behavior, including, quote, murder, theft, and religious intolerance. The Talmud also, quote, included strictures against trusting Gentiles, honoring them, or even returning a lost piece of property to them. With defenders like Rabbi Yehiel, the Talmud needed no enemies. The debate resulted in the public burning of the Talmud in Paris. The Jewish religion was now clearly seen not as biblical Judaism, but rather as a heretical deviation from the Old Testament. Over a 36-hour period in June 1242, over 10,000 volumes were consigned to the flames. As if determined to prove what the Christians had said was correct, a group of Jews appealed to Rome, quote, complaining that they could not practice their religion without the Talmud. In May 1244, Innocent IV relented. Quote, bound as we are by the divine command to tolerate them in their law, we thought fit to have the answer given them that we do not want to deprive them of their books, if as a result we should be depriving them of their law. The decision to return the Talmud to the Jews caused outrage. In 1254, Louis IX renewed the ordinance ordering the burning of the Talmud, as did both of his successors. When Louis X readmitted the Jews into France, he barred them from bringing the Talmud with them. The Church's campaign against the Talmud led to, quote, a crescendo of conversions, unquote, which by 1260 already necessitated special orders to facilitate the new Christians' integration into local society. The campaign was supplemented by the secular arm, which was determined to segregate the Jews to limit their pernicious influence. Louis IX implemented the anti-Jewish edicts of the Fourth Lateran Council by ordering all Jews within his realm to wear, quote, a circle of felt or yellow cloth stitched upon the outer garment in front and in back, about the size of a palm, so the simple folk might not fall unsuspecting into intercourse with Jews of the sort Raymond Lull would warn against. After the discovery of the Talmud, the Jews became, quote, the ultimate outsiders. The Jews, in Cohen's words, quote, had come to represent a reversal or denial of the social order as it was intended to be. They became revolutionaries, outlaws, and subversives, and by the end of the 13th century, they were universally recognized as such. The expulsions that followed were the official recognition of status that had its roots in the discovery of the Talmud. By the second quarter of the 15th century, Cantor says, more than half the Jewish elite and an unknown proportion of the Jewish masses, at least 100,000 people, had converted to Christianity. These included great merchants, government officials, and rabbinical scholars. Some of the scholars advanced to prominent roles in the clergy. A prominent 15th century bishop of Burgos in Castile was a former rabbi, and his son became a bishop. The Jews were expelled from Cologne in 1424, from Speyer in 1435, and from Mainz in 1438. In 1492, in an act that would have momentous consequences for the revolutionary movement, the Jews were expelled from Spain. These events, Glick says, referring to the conversions and expulsions, dealt a blow to Ashkenazic Jewry from which it never recovered. By 1450, the medieval phase of Jewish history in Germany and France had ended. The Ashkenazim migrated to Poland, which would eventually become the Paradisus Judaeorum, until their excesses as tax farmers between the nobility and the peasants helped to eventually cause a Chelmnicki pogroms. The Sephardim migrated to the Spanish Netherlands, that is, the Spanish Jews, where they would link up with the English Protestants, the Puritans, who were kicked out of England or left England, and German Anabaptists to create the Iconoclast Rebellion of 1566.